Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 29th of April of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this evening we got a lot of very important updates about Ukraine. According to information we have, according to different statements of Trump, the situation for Ukraine is getting worse and worse. I think that nation will be crushed very shortly. Trump says he's saving Ukraine. Ukraine will be crushed very soon, that was stated by Trump. I think I'm saving this country, Ukraine. I think this country will be crushed very soon. Russia is a big war machine, the American president said. Also, Donald Trump stated that he is not on the side of Zelensky. He's not with him. Also, he added that when talking about additional help to Ukraine, he told us that it doesn't have to be guns. There are many types of guns. It doesn't have to be guns with bullets. It could be guns with sanctions. It could be guns with banking. It could be many different types of guns, the US president replied. He stated most likely about possibilities to increase sanction pressure on the Russian Federation, which is most likely is going to happen if Russia and Ukraine will not sit at the same table for the, let's say, talks and negotiations. Another important piece of news is coming from Kiev, probably the most important one. So according to information we have, according to the general staff of Ukraine, the recruiters will be sent to the front. This applies to those who did not fight and have no health restrictions. I'll remind you to carry out mobilization, to conduct mobilization on the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainian authorities were forced to create another army of recruiters. And according to information we have, by the end of the 29th of April of 2025, this army has more than 110,000 soldiers. So these people who all over the entire territory of Ukraine were capturing and kidnapping people with the purpose to send them further to the line of combat contact and to the recruit centers. So now we see that according to the general staff, these people would be mobilized as well if they did not fight and have no health restrictions. This is very important because this situation confirms several things. First thing is that if Ukrainians decided to mobilize these recruiters, this means that they're not planning to carry out any more mobilization in the future, because those who were mobilizing Ukrainians now will be sent to the line of combat contact, which means that there are no more people who would continue this mobilization process. Once again, this applies to those who did not fight and have no health restrictions, which means that this situation will fit around 80% of these armies. So around 80,000-90,000 people would be sent to the line of combat contact according to this small paragraph, according to this small, let's say, classification. Another important thing is that Ukrainians are planning to carry out final offensive operation. Maybe final offensive operation, maybe final strike before the beginning of the negotiation process. I'll remind you that there are several targets that Ukrainians would try to capture before the beginning of talks. Of course, we are talking about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. We are talking about mines in the vicinity of the city of Pokrovsk. So there are many places where Ukrainians can counterattack. And Ukrainians, of course, can attack deep inside of the territory of Russian Federation with the purpose to exchange possible territories they managed to capture on, let's say, once again, on the territory of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, or let's say on the territory of the Kinburn Spit or some other territories in Kherson direction. So very interesting piece of news, but probably the most important, that if Ukrainians decided to mobilize mobilizers, those who were mobilizing, most likely they're planning to stop this process in the very near future. Now let's move to the line of combat contact and let's talk about situation on the ground. And first let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the settlement by the name of Belovody. Currently there are very heavy clashes for this settlement, and we expect that due to the beginning of clashes for this village, we expect that in the very near future the Russians will intensify their activities and their offensive operation in the direction of Vodolahi and in the direction of the settlement by the name of Volodymyrovka. Obviously, the main target and the main purpose of the armed force of the Russian Federation in the very near future to establish complete control over this territory. If the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory, then the situation for the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of Yunakivka would be much worse in comparison with the current situation, because from this line the Russians will be able to establish complete fire control over the main supply line that Ukrainians use to support their forces in this village. And obviously the settlement of Yunakivka is a part of Russia's secure plan. The plan that tells us that the Russians are trying to establish some buffer zone along the border with the Russian Federation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Belgorod direction. According to information we have, the Russians are about to finish the clearing of this territory. Mainly pro-Russian and neutral resource and pro-Ukrainian resources reported and confirmed Russian progress on the ground. For example, pro-Ukrainian source Deep State reported that the Russians managed to secure the village of Demidovka completely. As for the forest along the border, there are still very heavy crashes, but today several pro-Russian mappers reported that this forest was also secured. As for geolocations, we have just this video. And in this video we can see how the Russians were moving from one forest to another, trying to cross the road, and the Ukrainians were attacking these Russian soldiers. So when we return back to this map, the Russians, those Russian soldiers were moving through this, let's say, road from one forest to another. And this video confirms that most likely the Russians have their positions at least in this part of the forest. So we can say that most likely the Russians currently control at least this territory. As for now, we're not going to adjust the map. Maybe right exactly when the Russians were crossing the road, there were very heavy clashes for this part. Maybe the Russians haven't managed to force the Ukrainians to fall back. But anyway, we have first proofs that the Russians indeed begin offensive in the direction of this forest with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back further in the direction of the border. So there are very heavy clashes, and this information was confirmed. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northern Kupiansk direction, because today we got a lot of updates from this territory. First of all, let's talk about the settlement of Kaminka. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to completely secure the village of Kaminka. Yesterday, this information was confirmed by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and by several videos that were published by the Russians. Today we got another video where we can see another episode of how the Russian soldier raised a Russian flag in the most northern part of the settlement. So now we have no doubts that the Russians control the territory of Kaminka completely. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to create something like a buffer zone around the settlement itself. We see that the Russians are planning to continue offensive. Currently, the main purpose and the main target of the Russians farms and some facilities to the northwest of the settlement, and from this foothold, the Russians most likely will continue offensive operation further in the direction of the settlement by the name of Dvorechensky. The problem is that there are big distances between settlements in this area because it's low populated area. So that is why the Russians will be forced to probably move very slowly due to these big gaps between villages and settlements. Another important update is coming from the Kupiansk direction itself. According to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians, as a result of active operations, more precisely the units of the Group of Forces West, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Doroshovka. So this is exactly the settlement the Russians were talking about. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map when we have colored this pocket in Russian favor. But there are several problems with this pocket, because obviously when the Russians secured the territory of this village, most likely the Russians didn't attack the village within these roads of attack. And most likely the Russians currently control not just the village, because most likely they have some secure buffer around the settlement. So due to this report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we believe that currently the Russians in this direction control something like this. Or at least there are no more Ukrainians, but maybe the Russians have strong, at some positions they don't have strong control. Anyway, we believe that this is exactly the area of Russian presence, because just village is not enough to control, and we believe that the territories around are also under complete Russian control. If this information is correct, or if we get additional proofs of this, we can say that the situation for the Ukrainians is getting worse and worse, because during the previous months, since the beginning of the special military operation, the Ukrainians had several ways how to supply and support this part of Kharkiv region. There are two roads that go from the settlement of Kupiansk, R79 road, and road that goes from the settlement of Kupiansk further in the northern directions towards the settlement of Konstantinovka. So this is the second road and this is the first road. And as you can see, the first road, R79, was taken by the Russians a long time ago. And now we see that the Russians managed to get as close as possible to this next supply line, and most likely during the next days the Russians will begin offensive operation with the purpose to answer this settlement and to take this settlement under complete control. If the Russians are able to do this, if the Russians are able to improve their positions further in the western direction, this can lead to complete collapse of supply and support of this part of Kharkiv region, or at least the logistic shoulder would be too big, and the supply and support logistic of this region would be too expensive for the Ukrainians, and obviously the Ukrainians would be forced to change their positions and to improve their logistic, probably with using the retreat tactics. So we see that the situation here is getting worse and worse. Now let's discuss the situation in the Liman direction. During the past 24 hours, we haven't received lots of updates. We have lots of FPV drone attacks, artillery strikes. We see that the Russians currently facing something like resistance from the Ukrainian side, fierce resistance. That is why we see that the Russians reduced their, let's say, tempo. Now the Russians, they're attacking, but not so fast. They're moving, but not so fast. We see that the Russians have a lots of job to do right now. They're bombing and attacking and seeking for Ukrainian positions. But obviously, this situation will take place for 1 or 2 weeks, but then the Russians will be able to continue offensive. But most likely, due to the current situation, general or major Russian offensive operation will begin after the end of the May ceasefire. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction, in the area, in the direction of the major battle of 2025. The Russians, as you can see, continue advancing from the southwest, from the south, from the southeast, from the east, and from the northeast. The Russians during the past 24 hours managed to improve their positions along the entire line of combat contact. Some of the advances were confirmed by neutral, by pro-Ukraine, by pro-Russian resources. We see that the situation for the Ukrainians is getting very difficult, and maybe the recruiters would be sent exactly in this direction with the purpose to stabilize the situation. By the way, some sources reported that Syrsky decided to recruit recruiters because recruiters failed the plan of mobilization. Now let's discuss in details, and first let's talk about the city of Chasiv Yar, where defense, according to updates we have, mainly according to pro-Russian resources, collapsed completely. First of all, the Russians managed to establish almost complete control over the settlement by the name of Chasiv Yar. We're talking about the central part. Currently, according to different mappers and according to different sources, the Ukrainians control just these several buildings in the central part. The rest, which is, according to this map, is still in yellow color, is already in the gray zone or under complete Russian control. This information today was provided by the pro-Russian resources. The Ukrainians just control these 2 buildings just with one purpose: to maintain a corridor for evacuation. And due to this configuration and due to these updates, we believe that the next night between the 29th and 30th of April is going to be final and the last night for the Ukrainians on the ground in the city, in the central part of the city. Most likely tomorrow, the central part of the city of Chasiv Yar would be colored completely in the Russian favor. At the same time, I'll remind you that several days ago, several pro-Russian resources reported about significant breakthrough in the southeastern part of the city of Chasiv Yar. And when talking about report that we got several days ago, the Russians currently control something like this in the southern and the eastern parts of the city of Chasiv Yar. So everything to the east of this red line is already under complete Russian control. So this is another point of breakthrough of the Russians in this citadel, in the most important city in the Konstantinovka direction. Furthermore, we continue receiving the second day in a row about Russian progress on the ground in the area of the village by the name of Stupachki. According to information we have, the Russians during the past 24 hours managed to improve their positions once again on the territory of the city of settlement of Stupachki, and the Russians continue advancing. So, according to all these updates, we see that Ukrainian lines in this area collapsed completely, and most likely the Ukrainians would not be able to stabilize the situation anymore. We expect that the next defense line where the Ukrainians will try to slow down the Russians is the line between company strongholds, the village of Mykolaievka, the village of Chervona, this dense network of the fortifications, and the settlement of Pritechina. There are very likely, there are very high chances that somewhere around 9th of May, the Russians will be able to reach this yellow line, and this is going to be the next line of combat contact, the final line of combat contact before entering the city of Konstantinovka itself. Now, let's move further. According to information we have, there are very heavy clashes along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. Today, several pro-Russian resources reported that Ukrainian lines in this direction collapsed as well. Ukrainians were forced to fall back, and the Russians, according to information we have, managed to improve their position significantly. Several very reliable pro-Russian resources reported that there are serious success in the Azaryanovka area and in the Donetsk direction in general. On the flank, battles are already underway in the area of Delievka. We're talking about one near the railway behind Dachny. Our drones are working quite confidently in the area of Klibanbyk and Katerinovka. So the Russians are saying that this is area of another breakthrough where the Russians managed to defeat Ukrainians and to force them to fall back further in the western directions towards the settlement of Delievka. Now the Ukrainians are trying to prepare another defense belt with the purpose to stabilize the situation, or at least to hold the Russians for a while exactly along this yellow line. As for now, we have just artillery strikes, artillery explosions, artillery, let's say, attacks from the Russian side. We expect that during the next 24-48 hours, we're going to receive either reports from different sources that confirm Russian progress on the ground, or some geolocations that we will use to adjust the map. So the situation on this flank is also very difficult. And we are not surprised with this, because we see that the Russians are attacking in the area of Stupochki, and if the Russians are able to establish complete control, let's say if the Russians are able to capture, let's say, these territories, the village of Stupochki and some outskirts and some positions around, we know that the Russians have control over Nilipovka. This can lead to encirclement and to another cauldron for the armored forces of Ukraine in this pocket, because the distance between these two positions is less than 7 kilometers, which is nothing for FPV drones and sometimes even for sabotage and reconnaissance group. So maybe this is the reason why the Ukrainians decided to fall back from the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, trying to get as close as possible to Alexandra Shultina, to the settlement of evacuation, where you can see a straight road to the city of Konstantinovka. So we see Ukrainians are trying to get as close as possible to the main evacuation lines. They don't want to be captured and caught and cauldron by the Russians. As for the Kliban-Byksky pocket, we see situation here is very difficult. The Russians are bombing and attacking this territory with all calibers they have, with FAPs, with artillery strikes, with everything they have. But as for the previous 24 hours, we don't see any changes on the ground. But as for now, it doesn't matter, because the Russians are focused right now on destroying Ukraine's temporary deployment points and temporary positions. The Russians control the settlement of Cherbinovka, and during the next probably 48 hours, we're going to see first attempts to attack. The Russians establish complete FPV drone control over the most southern parts of the pocket. We have lots of icons, lots of videos how the Russians were FPV droning and attacking artillery systems, temporary deployment points, machine gun positions, anti-tank positions, FPV drone positions of the armored forces of Ukraine. So lots of episodes, but without, as you can see, any changes on the ground. Also, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Nova Poltavka. According to different sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take lots of territories under complete control. The Russians currently are trying to take under control probably strategical positions for defense to secure the western flank of Kliban-Byksky offensive. We discussed the situation many times. As you can see, there are water reservoirs around this area, and as you can see, there are very small corridors for any maneuvers. So if the Russians somehow are able to establish complete control, let's say, over these territories with the settlements of Malinovka, Nova Poltavka, Nova Olenivka, which is most likely the primary target for the armored force of the Russian Federation, then the Russians from these positions would be able to secure their western flank, and the Ukrainians would not be able to counterattack the Russians, because it would be very difficult to attack through these very short corridors. Russians basically would destroy everything if Ukrainians, let's say, decide to counterattack along M32 road. If they enter between these two reservoirs, the Russians will be able to destroy everything. If Ukrainians decide, let's say, to counterattack the Russians through the fields, obviously they're going to be the same story between these two reservoirs. Ukrainians will have very small, let's say, areas for maneuvers, and this is what the Russians are planning to use with the purpose to secure the western flank until the main Russian forces are moving deep inside of this pocket from many directions. So the major battle for Konstantinovka once again has begun. As for the Pokrovsk direction, today we got very important statements. Today, the Ukrainian authorities decided to evacuate this region. So this entire territory is currently under, let's say, complete evacuation. We're talking about 4 settlements right now. We're talking about the village of Mizhova, the village of Raipolye, and the villages of Sukhaya Balka and Novodpodgorodnya. So the question is, why the Ukrainians decided to evacuate this region? Some sources are saying that the Ukrainians are planning to bring forces and they need some rooms, some flats, some house apartments for deployment, so that is why they have evacuated this area. Other sources reported that the Russians are about to enter this territory, so that is why Ukrainians want to remove civilians and children first of all. So what is happening right now from the Russian side? Today, pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions around the settlement of Kotlarovka. So another fields, another tree lines were taken by the Russians during the previous 24 hours. So these are the changes and this is the situation on the ground here. Furthermore, the Russian sources and pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed complete control over the settlement by the name of Uspienovka. This information, first of all, was confirmed today by pro-Ukrainian deep state. And I'll remind you that during the previous days, the Russians were significantly advancing on the line between Nova Elizavetovka and Nova Alexandriivka. So we can see the changes on the ground during the previous several days, which means that the Russians were attacking using these roads of attack during the previous days. And now we see the entire picture. The Russians are trying to attack and to take under control the line of villages Muravka, Novo Nikolaevka, Nova Sergeyevka, Nova Alexandrovka in the very near future. This is the last defense line of the armored forces of Ukraine on the Russia's way to the Dnipro region. And we see that the Russians are trying to take this territory under control, trying to attack these 4 villages at least from 4 directions. So this is the vital, decisive battle, and this battle will give us the answer whether the Russians are able to enter the Dnipro region or not. As for the Bogatyr direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians made another attempt to take under control the settlement of Bogatyr by attacking this village from south, southeast, and from the east. And according to geolocations that we got during the previous day, we see that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to get a bit closer to the settlement, but once again, without entering the village itself. The Russians managed to improve their positions to the east and to the southeast between the settlements of Konstantinovka, Rozliv, and Bogatyr itself. These are the changes on the ground, and the Russians, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, managed to improve their positions along the tree line and to get very close to the company's stronghold in the southwestern part of the settlement. We understand that if Ukrainians lose control over the village of Bogatyr, most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to hold their lines in the village of Alexeyevka for a very long period of time. If Ukrainians lose both villages, then most likely these entire territories, these entire positions to the east of this and to the southeast of this red line would collapse automatically, and the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back further in the northwestern direction. So this is the battle for the final stronghold in the South Donetsk direction. After this, the Russians will continue advancing from the southeastern directions towards the village of Novopavlovka. So the battle for Dnipro region is about to be started, and very likely this battle can start before the 9th of May, and most likely the Russians will try to use this media victory during the 9th of May. As for the Zaporozhye direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special, just several explosions, several strikes carried out by the Russians, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground. As for the Dnipro direction, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything that can confirm that the Russians managed to cross the river of Dnipro and to establish control over the southern part of the settlement of Tyaginka. I'll remind you that yes, the several resources reported that the Russians crossed the river. Most likely those were sabotage and reconnaissance group that indeed crossed the river, but not with the purpose to establish control over the city of Kherson, but just to carry out some reconnaissance and sabotage operations. Most likely they were discovered, then the Russians answer some fightings, and most likely those fightings people recognized as the clashes, let's say, with the purpose to create foothold. So maybe something like this. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.